Let's talk about this program today. How did you get interested in DeSoto?
Well, the topic came up a few years ago, and the museum kind of tackled it a bit then, and we're bringing it back around now because we're going to kick off a series of programs that are going to theme along the lines of the Cherokee and the Upstate. So this is the first installment that relates to that general topic. But there's always been a lot of questions about DeSoto and the actual route that he took through South Carolina and North Carolina. So that's one of the things that we're tackling today to kind of answer a few of the questions people have.
So we're going to talk about, did he actually get to Anderson County?
The shortest answer is no, probably not. The more complicated answer is that there's definitely reasons why people have thought that for so long. And then we're going to present some of those reasons, the historical sources that have cited such things. And then we're also going to present the counter, which would be some of the more modern archaeological evidence that indicates more precise locations for the confirmed stops along his trail and where those would be. And it kind of circumnavigates all of Anderson County. If there were any Spanish in Anderson County in the 1500s, it might have been a smaller scouting group, possibly.
As a student of history and as a curator in a museum, do you think most people realize DeSoto was here before the Pilgrims?
Well, chronology is always interesting when you put it in different ways. But yeah, that's an interesting thought to have, that he would have been somebody. And again, he wasn't the first person even in South Carolina. We kind of begin the whole discussion with Aon, who came before him, and the sort of failed mission that he had. But then DeSoto's coming through, relying on some of the notes that were taken by people who came to the Americas before, including some of Aon, and they've actually found artifacts to be in possession of people they met in the Columbia vicinity that had been left by the Aon expedition. So they found evidence of the people who came before them as far as conquistadors were concerned. So this program today is an interesting one. This on DeSoto's trail. There's a couple of different reasons why we landed on this topic. The first one is that we are going to have an exhibit opening on April the 23rd that's on the Cherokee culture in the upstate of South Carolina, especially in Anderson County. Different sites that we know of and reports of sites and archaeological findings over the years that point to the Cherokee in Anderson County. So it'll be an interesting exhibit for sure, but surrounding it and while it's running, we want to have programming that kind of intersects with the topic of the Cherokee. And this was the first one, hopefully, in what will be a series of programs that relate to the Cherokee. So this one, first contact, of course, is not the beginning of the Cherokee story at all. So I would encourage you to come see more of the exhibit that kind of goes into their history even prior to first contact. But this program here obviously is going to focus on that 1500s era. This is interesting too because there have so long been rumors that DeSoto and his band came through Anderson County when they came through South Carolina. So we'll also be discussing those, what merit they hold and where we actually think DeSoto could have been. But why go in the first place, right? There's three main reasons. When you go into school, they use the 3 G's as a sort of a cheat to help you remember these three things of God, glory, and gold. So God is referring, of course, to the spreading of Catholicism. This was a huge initiative, especially for the Spanish, but essentially all of the explorers had some goal of converting some of the native populations in the Americas to their religions. But it wouldn't necessarily be as emotional or spiritual an experience as you might think of religious conversion today. Sometimes this was much more of a diplomatic tool. This was something, you guys convert to Christianity and agree to worship the way we worship, and then we'll return, we'll give you in return supplies or trinkets or trade materials, weapons, other things that you might need to continue on. So it was political, trade relationship, but also expanding the influence of Catholicism in the New World. And second being glory, kind of referring back to bringing glory to the mother country of Spain. Not only were you trying to bring win glory for God spread Catholicism, you're also trying to bring wealth and influence back to the mother country of Spain. Colonization was pretty much all about spheres of influence, and especially in this time period when you're looking at the naval capabilities of different countries rising all in tandem, they're competing for areas of influence, resources that would be available in the New World. So certainly, and also this coincides with some of the rise of piracy and privateering that you might talk about in South Carolina history as well. Down the road, this would be the entrance into what we might call the Atlantic world as well. So, third, gold. Everybody wanted gold. For pretty much all of human history, gold's been recognized as a valuable substance for one reason or another, and the Spanish were certainly after that. And we'll come back to that in some more detail here in a minute. Exploration costs quite a lot of money, and it's a kind of interesting relationship when you think about exploring today versus exploring in the 1540s. Some of the same things still stand true. When we first started heading towards space, for instance, you weren't going to have private companies who were interested in building shuttles in the 1940s and 50s because there's no guarantee of return. Normally, the government would be the ones to front the most risky costs when it comes to exploration. And then once it's been established that this trip is worth making, then you get your private industries that want to come in and establish some of those transatlantic trades that you see later on in the century. So the government was one of those entities that would have been able to front the cost. And these are some of the key players as we head in. Spanish exploration in the Americas began especially around 1492. King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella were some of the funders of the famous navigator Christopher Columbus, his expedition to find a route towards India. But upon landing on the island of San Salvador in the Bahamas, he claimed those lands for the Spanish crown. The Pope did confirm, he said that any Spanish claim to land in North America would be recognized, and Isabella ended up passing away in about 1504, leaving her daughter Juana as the Queen of Castile. Another key player briefly would be Charles V. He was the King of Spain in 1516 upon the death of his grandfather, who had been Ferdinand. He also would be elected Holy Roman Emperor in 1519, but he would later abdicate the throne, to Philip II. And he was interesting in the sense that he saw himself as sort of an embodiment of all of the goals of Spain at the time. So he was the defender of true Catholicism, and he saw his country as the main stronghold of the faith, and it would therefore be their duty to go and spread the message in the New World. Now, gold, we got to come back to it because this wasn't just, there was genuinely the idea that a city of gold existed in the Americas, or at least the promise of immense wealth. And legends like the city of El Dorado were not considered legends to a lot of the conquistadors, but rather this was a goal. There's some evidence, though, that the original form of the legend, El Dorado, was referring to a man and not to a city. This being that there was this area where a man would be coated in gold dust before ceremonially washing in Lake Guadavita. And this was kind of like a rite of initiation for his people. So over time, the legend of El Dorado grew from that, and you could imagine the steps. It didn't take a lot of steps. There's so much gold in this place that they can coat a man in gold and wash it off in the lake. How much gold do they have? And it becomes this region of gold that you could see someone building it into a city of gold in their heads, right? So this was something that was a goal for the Spanish, and a real one. A place with that much gold, it had to be found, and this immense place of riches would be found in the wilderness of the New World. So we've got some of their motives, but we need to introduce ourselves to the explorers themselves too. So the average conquistador, kind of your regular stormtrooper level guy, right, would have been a young man with military experience, but probably not from the upper echelon of wealthy families in Spain. May have been more of a working class background, but this was an opportunity to move up in the social ladder, of course. There was this Hidalgo class, which would have been kind of a middle range of income, and a lot of your leadership for the conquistadors came from that class already. And if they proved themselves out here in the New World, then they had this opportunity to rise up in social ranking, as well as in military ranking and power as well. So there was a lot of looting that was also going to be going on. These guys would divvy up things that they found and the riches, but 1/5 of it always went back to Mother Spain. That was the largest share, and then the rest of the loot would have been divided up based on rank, all the way down the ladder. So a huge one thing to bear in mind throughout the whole discussion, of course, is that the goal of acquiring riches was at one of the top things on the list that the conquistadors would be doing. And one of the ways that they did that in a lot of instances was to be either dishonest or outright violent towards some of the indigenous population. And at the best, they could be dishonest. At the worst, it was taking prisoners and slaves. It was killing people. It would have been sort of manipulating to get information about the next town before they got there. So all this was going on at the same time. But again, all the goal would have been to convert people, if they will, take what they have for the mother country of Spain, and figure out what the New World has to offer in terms of natural resources. So, one of the first Europeans to set foot, in fact, the first Europeans to set foot in South Carolina was a group of Spaniards that was led by this man here, Lucas de Ayllon. This was in 1526. De Soto's not coming through until about 1539, 1540. So this is prior to him. They landed at a place called Winyah Bay near present-day Georgetown, South Carolina. And they established a small settlement there, which was abandoned after only 3 months. And there were a number of reasons why. But out of 600 colonists who landed, only 150 survived that first winter in South Carolina. It was a failed expedition, you could say, but evidence of it comes up later in De Soto's travels, so it's really important. He was going, a lot of the knowledge that he had was based on notes that were taken by prior explorers, and especially referring to his first few weeks and months through Florida. But there comes this juncture point where he would split off from what had been explored before, and then he accidentally runs into some of the remnants from the Ayllon expedition too. But some of the key firsts here, it's believed that this would have been the site, this village that was set up by Ayllon and his men, would have been the first site of a Roman Catholic Mass in the United States, what would become the United States. And it was also the first site of a slave revolt in South Carolina. It didn't take very long at all. So the conquistadors come in, they take prisoners and slaves from among the indigenous population, and within a month or two, they revolted. And that was part of the reason that the whole thing failed. So there were some things in particular that Hernando de Soto was trying to avoid based on these experiences that the Spaniards had already had, and they will come up in short order. But Hernando himself, he was born in 1496 in Spain to parents who were kind of in the Spanish gentry, more upper class. So his first encounter with the New World was actually in 1514. He had been to Central America and came in to explore parts of what had been the Inca Empire with Francisco Pizarro. And on his return to Spain in 1536, he married his wife named Isabella, and he was also at that time made the Adelantado of Florida by, at that time, Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. So, in 1538, he decides to sail from Spain to Havana, and that was with his wife, with 600 Spanish soldiers, and some Portuguese volunteers and slaves, and it also, the whole group included maybe as many as about 20 women, but we know it was at least 6 to a dozen females who went on this trip as well. So, excuse me. In fact, his wife, he appointed Isabella as acting governor of Cuba when he set out from there to Florida. So she was one of the first Spanish women to hold a position of power in the Atlantic world as well, especially in the Spanish colonies. So De Soto leaves from Havana, Cuba in May of 1539. And his expedition, again, at this point had about 600 men and women and more than 200 horses. They had a herd of swine that they were going to bring with them. They brought a lot with them. It wasn't just a few explorers who were kind of tromping through the woods. This was an army of people who was coming through the wilderness of the Americas. And one of the first people they encountered was Juan Ortiz. And again, he had been separated from a prior expedition in Florida. And when they landed somewhere near Tampa Bay in the modern day. But it was not very long at all that they encountered Juan Ortiz. And apparently the legend goes that he had picked up the Native American languages that existed in Florida pretty well, but he had almost completely forgotten how to speak Spanish because it had been about 12 years since he got separated. So the legend is that he calls out Sevilla, which is the name of his hometown in Spain, and then recognizing the Spanish word, De Soto's men stopped the assault, and they kind of linked up. Juan Ortiz joins as a translator, and his knowledge of not only the languages, especially, it was crucial early on because the Native American languages were so related in Florida and southern Georgia, and even Ortiz was of use to all the way through the Carolinas as well. But he also was familiar with the geography and could help them find villages. And again, they were basing some of their early travels on notes that had been left prior, and they were trying to reach in particular a town in the Florida Panhandle called Appalachia, which would have been right near where this bend is occurring. So this is an approximate route that we're going to be looking at here today. It was a couple of, it was about March 3rd of 1540 when they made this northward turn into Georgia. And again, that was kind of the first decision that De Soto made on his own was, are we going to continue to hug the Gulf of Mexico and travel where we have notes from this prior expedition, or do we turn north into Georgia and see some things that haven't been seen quite yet? And again, Ayon had spent most of his time right around here, did not get very far inland, so everything that he was going to see was going to be new. And they did decide to go northward into Georgia. In fact, some of the notes from the De Soto expedition talk about southern to middle Georgia as being a desert when they went through. And I don't know how many of you are from Georgia or have been through that part of Georgia. In the Sandhills, maybe there are a few areas that you could see as more desertous than others when you get into that sandy soil. But it kind of makes you question, what did the geography really look like back then for him to use the word desert to describe southern Georgia? But regardless, in this time period for the expedition, they start to run low on resources. And we know that for a number of reasons. One of them is that apparently the rations were reduced a little bit. Most of the men were living on about half a pound of pork a day, that they were kind of butchering some of the swine herd that they had brought along with them. There was also at this time a lot of release. They would release prisoners and slaves or kill prisoners and slaves so that they would not have to feed them. So they're running low on supplies. But eventually they do, each new town that would be encountered by the group, they get this opportunity to kind of stock back up on supplies. And eventually they do successfully reach another town and make plans to cross the Savannah River into South Carolina. It was around this time, too, I should mention before we move on, a lot of people think that either during the crossing of the Savannah River in particular, there was a number of wild hogs that escaped the herd and were left on the other side of the river, or perhaps through this whole time, hogs were leaving the herd. And this was, in fact, the introduction of wild hogs to the Carolinas and the Southeast in general. So they were brought by the Spanish. This is one of the best documented parts of the whole De Soto journey. So they come across the Savannah River somewhere near Aiken, South Carolina, and they are looking for a town called Cofitachequi, or that's my best attempt at the town and its name. But by April, they were lost somewhere between the Savannah and Congaree rivers, and they weren't sure how to reach this region called Cofetachequi in what would now be South Carolina. So two of their Native American captives, they started to try to ask them about where there were areas of riches in this vicinity. Where could we go to restock? They don't have a good plan, so he sends out scouting groups in 4 different directions to try to either find the place or find someone who knows how to get there. And one of the scouting groups comes back with a guide who takes them on to the city of Cofetachequi. And this is an artist rendering. Initially, it was going really well. They were introduced to the leadership in the town. The Lady of Cofetachequi, as she's sometimes called, or the Queen in other documents. But she was very receptive to the Spaniards at first and gave them gifts, gave them some treasures, some wild turkeys, and things like that as good favor. And the relationship was seeming to be pretty positive at the start. But then, for a number of different reasons, it seems that it sort of turned sour and some mistrust developed. One of the things that was pressuring the Spaniards to move along, are we going to stay here? Are we going to settle? There's fertile farmland. We could just stay where we're at, or we could continue the journey. So they were trying to make this decision, when do we leave? And if we do, then where are we going next? And then also, items from the Aeon expedition were found to be in possession of the tribe here at Cofetachequi. So this leaves a couple of different possibilities, 2 of them being that Aeon had contact with them himself, and maybe these were among some of the reasons that the expedition was failed, so they might mistrust them for that reason if they thought that they attacked Aeon, or they had traded with people who had contact with Aeon. So these items had reached way further inland than Aeon had ever traveled, probably around the modern city of Columbia. But the decision was made for the Spaniards to leave, and in the process they took several prisoners from the town, including the Lady of Cofetachequi herself. They took her as a prisoner and left. So the rest of the journey here, this is one of the better accepted maps of the route. We've already talked about where he landed and came in and met Juan Ortiz. They made it to the town of Appalachia and decided to turn north into Georgia. They crossed the Savannah River somewhere near Aiken, and then here's Cofetachequi here, centrally kind of located in South Carolina. And then this is the trail that we're looking at for the rest of the time. When he and his expedition decided to leave Cofetachequi, again, they took some of the members of the tribe as well as the lady herself. And the chief, she actually managed to escape somewhere near the Cherokee town of Jorah, which on this map is located here. This is somewhere in the modern vicinity of Morganton, North Carolina, when she escaped the group. And the explorers continued on into Tennessee, across the French Broad River. And Juan Ortiz passes away in late 1541. But by this point, there was a boy who had been taken captive at Cofetachequi and spent several weeks with the band. And he picked up on enough of the languages that he stepped in to serve as the next translator. He had become fluent in Spanish too. So by May of 1542, Hernando de Soto had reached the Mississippi. One of the problems here, I told you that there was some deception that had been employed to convince some of the Native Americans of different things they needed to be doing. So one of the deceptions that was often told was that Hernando de Soto was some form of deity himself. And this became a huge problem when he got a fever and died overnight, because deities don't die. So the band decided that they would basically dispose of his body in the Mississippi River before any of the prisoners saw it. And a new leader had to be elected. In fact, De Soto himself had kind of appointed someone new to take charge of the group upon realization that he was going to die. And they concealed his death again in the river before but the day before he had named Luis de Moscoso as one of his field commanders as the new leader. So they continue on down. Let me get back to the map here. From that point, part of the band here, you can see towards Texas and then towards the Gulf of Mexico. A lot of disagreement occurred as well. It appears that De Soto was kind of the piece that was holding this whole thing together, and none of the group was particularly cooperative with each other after this point. By 1543, there was 311 surviving members of the expedition that arrived in a Spanish-held town of Panuco, down towards the coast. And the mayor of this town had tried to get some people to come, the new ships, to pick them up or whatever they were going to do to get back to Havana or to Spain. And they had to travel to a third location, and he sent them off in parties of no more than 20 because they were having such trouble getting along. That way they wouldn't kill each other on the way to meet the ship, basically. So it wasn't going very well. But that was a sort of a abrupt end to the expedition, but we do have to take a look back because the remaining question is, where exactly did he go, and did he come through Anderson County? For a long time, Anderson historians have theorized that De Soto's expedition passed through either the Anderson area specifically or at least through the county. And there are reasons why this is thought. So we'll go through a few of those. This map reflects some of the early scholarship about where De Soto was thought to have been. And you can see in this version, crossing the river here and turning northward, it even has Anderson specifically on this route. And there's reasons why this was thought. There's a couple of different clues. We've already mentioned the fact that some of the introduction here of wild hogs came from the Spanish in our area and escaped the caravan. There's also long been the explanation for the horse pasture area having received that name because Spanish horses were either left or escaped from the band of Spaniards and ended up in that area to be called horse pasture near Oconee. There's also a lot of different things to do with Andersonville. Historians have pointed out that this is one of the more prolific areas of growth for this particular rose that some people call the Cherokee rose, and it's believed that the Spanish had the seeds for this in their possession when they were coming through, so why would it be here unless the Spanish dropped the seeds? That's one of the things. One of the big ones that's been reported for almost the entirety of the 20th century is that nearly, if not a full suit of armor, then some very significant and large pieces of Spanish armor were found in the vicinity of Andersonville. And this was reported in the newspaper multiple times and then recounted in other newspaper articles later on. So that's one of the reasons, pieces of sort of evidence that people try to point to when they think that the Spanish were here. But there's been a lot of new scholarship. This is, again, the map that we saw was based on some of the scholarship that would have been popular in the 20s, 30s, 40s. I think the map that we looked at was published in the 50s. And in fact, it was done by a historic site that was kind of built up around where they thought De Soto landed. Some of the people associated with that historic site put that together in the 1950s. But since then, people have gotten very specific with how they do history, and everything has gotten smaller and smaller and smaller. You get these pockets of really deep knowledge about one particular thing that contribute to our wide understanding, right? So when we have experts who are able to dive into very, very specific questions, they come up with very specific answers, and it can change the way that we look at some of the same clues that we had. De Soto's expedition, they described this area where there was a convergence of two large rivers into an even larger third river, and some have looked at the Tugelo and the Seneca and the Savannah and said, well, why couldn't it be that? But you can see that there's also the convergence of these rivers around Columbia, which kind of shoots a hole, or begins to shoot holes in some of it. They talk about the presence of a large centralized village that's near a river. Some people have believed the Savannah River matches the accounts in ways, and it's also known that an indigenous town existed in the vicinity of Aiken where they would have crossed. So a lot of people have thought in the past that maybe Aiken was the spot where they turned northward after meeting the lady of Cofetachequi. So the problem with that, of course, is that we have this other geographic area that matches it up a lot better. We also now have archaeological evidence of the precise location of Cofetachequi itself. So as we go through here, I need to find where I'm at in my notes. I've actually lost it. But there's other clues that indicate this as well, a northward turn that would have occurred more east of Aiken. And one of the reasons for that is in the notes, there was a lot of time that transpired between the crossing of the Savannah River and actually meeting the Lady of Cofetachequi. So that amount of travel time, and this also incorporates, we talked about how there were scouting troops that were sent out to find their direction. Even incorporating that into the amount of time, the actual time spent traveled, would have been well more than required to reach Aiken and turn north. It would have been further into the state. We also have the problem of discovering items that belong to Aeon. If it would be a lot harder to believe that the De Soto expedition would have encountered evidence of Aeon in Anderson County as opposed to Richmond County, for instance, or north of Columbia, because of the sheer distance away from the coast where Aeon would have landed. Again, we've also got some new native oral history information that coincides with archaeological evidence from dig sites in Jorah. In fact, in our Tuesday program, one of the people who had actually been on a dig he had worked with Warren Wilson College about 3 or 4 years ago. They were still excavating the site at Jorah in Morganton and finding new evidence of this. So this pushes it up. It had the expedition turn north at Aiken and come through Anderson. Their explanation for the locations of Zula and Jorah would have been closer to Kiowee and then one of the other towns, maybe above the Kuala boundary. But those sites now more or less confirm that Zula would have been closer to Saluda and then Jorah would have been closer to Morganton. But what about all the stuff in Andersonville? There's still that evidence to contend with. The Cherokee roses do not exclusively grow in Andersonville area, or what would have been. I failed to mention that the whole site of Andersonville is now underneath Lake Hartwell. Andersonville Island being the only kind of high point that still pokes out. So all of this evidence coming from before the lake filled up, but it's prolific throughout Georgia and other parts of South Carolina. So it's not unreasonable to think that these seeds could have spread naturally no matter where the root would have been precisely. And the armor pieces itself. While there are reports and many reports and republishings of the same story about finding Spanish armor, to my knowledge, there were no pictures taken of the armor. It doesn't still exist somewhere in the county, and if it does, no one's brought it forward. So it's several different things could have happened. One of them is that Spanish armor was found, and it was put into a private collection and went where it went. But that still wouldn't necessarily mean that it was De Soto's band. It could have been one of these smaller scouting groups that came through the area, or it could have been traded up to this point as well. So it's kind of a difficult thing to say whether it should be attributed to De Soto's band themselves. The other is that a lot of the wealthy landowners had private collections themselves that would have included some of these kinds of crazy items. So it's not unreasonable either to think that a wealthy planter may not have acquired some pieces of interest that got left in the Andersonville area as well. Why do we need to argue about where De Soto went in the first place? Well, there are benefits, of course, to having historic sites in your town, tourism. People come in on historic tourism all the time to different places to take in the American story, to take in all kinds of different history. And of course, grant funding can be tied up in proving exactly where and how events took place. grant funding to help preserve sites, grant funding to build up sites where where there's not interpretation yet. So all these things are tied into why people would want to be included on the trail, regardless of what we might be able to prove. So I think it's interesting, though, in South Carolina especially, how each small town finds a way to plug itself into stories, even if that may not be the case eventually. So we do a lot of general correction in the modern day. You don't want to tell people that they're wrong necessarily outright, but in certain cases we have been wrong in the past, and more modern scholarship points us in the right direction. And this is one of those areas where we think we've got a pretty good handle now on where De Soto went, and the trail wouldn't have come through here, unfortunately.